Peter, as H.G. Adler's translator, you've done a lot to bring this writer to the attention of a wider audience, both in the English-speaking world, but also in the German-speaking world. I was wondering if you could tell us how you discovered Adler and why it is that he's been so neglected when he seems to be such an important writer.
Right. Well, it was just a piece of luck, really. I was in Schoenhof's bookstore in Cambridge, Massachusetts, a foreign language bookstore, and pulled Adler's novel Eine Reise off the shelf and read 2 or 3 pages right there in the bookstore, and immediately realized that I had to translate it, that it was a work that I was deeply interested in. It was the style of the novel, the music of the sentences, the syntax, the rhythms that attracted me, and I didn't know anything about Adler at that time and assumed that he was rather well known, and then found out that sort of no one knew anything about Adler. Why that is, I think, has to do with the world wasn't ready for him. The novels are highly modernist, multi-voiced, dense, very the experience that they depict of the camps and the Holocaust is in many ways aestheticized and made symbolic. And the world was more prepared for memoirs or novels that sort of functioned on a kind of immediate kind of memoir experience. And he also left Czechoslovakia, where he was born, after the war in 1947, lived in London, lived on the margins of German literature in exile, and sort of had this misfortune of not having good publishers, and yet persisted in his work and his writing, completing 26 books in his lifetime.
It's your translation of most recently Panorama, and also an earlier translation of a book called Eine Reise.
Right, although I called it The Journey. Adler intended for it to be called Die Reise, and his publisher talked him out of it. So I was able to restore the title that he wanted in the translation and called it The Journey. Yeah.
These 2 translations have garnered a lot of critical attention. There was a lengthy article in the New Yorker recently. She's obviously very, very nice, and it seems also to have had an effect on the novels in Germany, or it's kind of a good example of how translation can set things in motion, or sort of shine a light back on the original.
Well, ironically, the other great example of that is W.G. Sebald, where it was the attention that he garnered in America, in fact, from the New Yorker. The same thing. Susan Sontag wrote a very important piece on Sebald and his The Emigrants, and really sort of put him on the map. That's ironic because Sebald's last novel, Austerlitz, at the end of the novel contains a 15-page section which has to do with H.G. Adler, where Austerlitz, the title character, cites Adler's Theresienstadt study, and there are pages from Adler's book which are even included in Austerlitz itself. So what I think happens is that something is translated and it arrives in another culture and resonates in a particular way, and it garners attention back in the original country and language. And this has begun to happen with Adler. Conferences and critical works, his books have been reissued. Panorama was reissued in a new edition just last year. The other thing that's happening is that there are new translations of Adler into French, Italian, Spanish, Hebrew, Czech. So that's around the world that his reputation is beginning to grow. I think that's something that translation does. It helps infuse new blood into literature. It helps even the native literature to recognize the strength of what they have when there's a neglected writer in their midst who they haven't paid attention to.
Can you say a little bit about what differentiates Adler's writing about the Holocaust from other writing about the Holocaust? I know you mentioned it's a modernist text.
Well, I think it's that remove. I think it's that kind of musical inventiveness to it. That he is, for instance, in The Journey, there's no mention of Nazis or Jews or camps or Auschwitz or Theresienstadt, and yet we always know where we are, that we're on a journey to a pretty horrible place, and that most of the characters are not going to come out the other end of it. that kind of remove, that kind of philosophical remove. I think the other thing is that Adler is not just writing about the Holocaust. He's writing about the human condition. He's writing about history. He could see that what happened in the Holocaust would happen again in other forms. And indeed, places like Srebrenica or Rwanda, Darfur, where you have governments who take hold of systemized power and simply repress, target segments of their society and stir the rest of the society against those segments. Adler saw that as not being only unique to the Holocaust. He saw that this was a condition of the 20th century. And Elias Canetti, his friend, specifically praised the journey for that this was a book about displacement, and that it was a book about how displacement would be the plague of the 20th century. And he was right.
Adler was a German-speaking Czech Jew, like Franz Kafka. What, if any, is the relationship or the literary relationship between the two men?
Adler considered himself a literary descendant of Kafka. He considered himself the last in the line of the Prague school of writers, who, of course, the best known is Kafka, but also people like Robert Musil, Franz Werfel, several other writers as well. And you hear a lot of Kafka in Adler. The protagonist of Panorama is Joseph Kramer, Joseph K., from The Trial. And there's no question that there's an analogy to that. In The Journey, the Lustig family leaves the town of Stupart. There is no town named Stupart, and yet Kafka grew up on Stupartgasse in Prague. So these little kind of allusions and echoes are purposely embedded into the text. I also think that the kind of allegorical, symbolic handling of large bureaucratic systems has a lot to owe to Kafka. In many ways, Kafka wrote about a symbolic nightmare which happened to correspond to reality, and Adler is writing about the real nightmare that he passed through, which he then extracts a symbolic tale out of. So it's kind of the dovetail of Kafka. It's the flip side of the coin.
Yeah. One of Adler's stated intentions upon entering the camps was to record the sort of minutiae, everything that he saw. And I know you mentioned in our events yesterday that he had these copious notes that I think he returned to Theresienstadt after the war to collect an attaché case of. And people's typical picture of the camps is that nobody had access to paper, and there was nowhere to record memories, literature for people to express themselves. But you're saying that was not the case.
Well, it's not the case in Theresienstadt, and Theresienstadt is a unique case. It wasn't a death camp. Many people died. It had the highest mortality rate of any location, and yet it ran as a small city. It had culture, it had cabarets, music was produced, operas were produced, writing was published, posters were made, art was made, and there was paper and typewriters, and it wasn't illegal to keep notes and things like that. So this was possible. It was a small culture, and he was there for 2.5 years, so which is a very long time to be there, and a very long time to have survived being there. He was lucky that he was able to leave the notes with Leo Beck, the spiritual leader of the Jews in Germany, and very deeply respected man, and then get back. He was lucky then to survive Auschwitz and Buchenwald, where it was harder to maintain notes and keep such documentation. There's a passage in Panorama which is autobiographical where his notes in Buchenwald are discovered, and it was just so happened that the officer at that time said, "Don't do it again," and that's it, whereas really he could have been killed. But he was lucky to have gotten through.
Adler's papers are in the the German Literary Archive in Marbach.
That's right.
And the papers from Theresienstadt, do they also form part of that archive?
Yes, it's all there, and it's everything, even the Black Attaché is there. I've seen it. Last year was Adler's centenary, and they had a small exhibit, and there was the Black Attaché case, which, if you think about it, when he came back to Theresienstadt after the war was over, it took him 2 months to get back from Auschwitz, and got the Black Attaché. He walked out of Theresienstadt with the next 40 years of his working life, because out of that came the Theresienstadt book, and all of the poems that he wrote. He wrote 130 poems in Theresienstadt, more in Auschwitz and Langenstein, and then obviously the workings of the novels, the 6 novels that he produced.
You've translated 2 of the books thus far, and you're working on a third.
I am, yes, yeah.
Which is?
The third is, the title is Die unsichtbare Wand, The Invisible Wall. Though again, his publisher talked him into changing the title from The Wall, Die Wand, and I intend to restore that title because the wall that surrounds the title character that exists between him and his past, he's a survivor, he's in England like Adler, it is not invisible, it's always there, and it's what keeps him from being able to go back and resolve the past, but also in another way keeps him from living in the future, from advancing into the future, so he's kind of damned to an eternal present. It's about survivor's guilt, it's about having lost his wife and many other family members, as did Adler himself.
Yeah. And you mentioned that, or you talked about he sort of re-encountered his childhood sweetheart in England after the war, and they married and had a son.
Yes.
Who is a professor of German in London.
Yes, Jeremy Adler, who's taught at King's College in London for many years, is also a very prominent critic and writer himself, is the literary executor for Elias Canetti, and has done a yeoman's work in keeping his father's work alive, seeing that editions were reprinted and articles have been written. He's written many articles himself, written forwards and afterwards to many of the books. And, it was fortunate that he did, so that people such as myself come along many years later, and there are a number of us who have come along who are interested in Adler and are helping to try to get him rediscovered.
Yeah. Adler's written 2 lengthy non-fiction texts. One of them is I believe a 900-page account of life in Theresienstadt.
Yes, right. Yeah.
That's not translated into English.
It is just been. It's about to appear. Will appear from Cambridge University Press in 18 months to 2 years' time. It's not myself. There was some. It's a group of translators who have been working on it, and they had started on it before I came on the scene. And I'm not sure I would have wanted to translate it anyhow. I'm more interested in the literary fiction. But it will appear from Cambridge University Press in 2 years' time. It was reissued in German a couple of years ago, and we'll be fortunate to have it in English. The other one is one called Die verwaltete Mensch, Administered Man, and it's the companion volume, and it's really about the entire administration of the Shoah, and covers it from top to bottom, and talking about the deportations, and is really an encyclopedia of the whole system of deportation.
Do you have plans beyond the third novel to move on to other literary work by Adler?
Yeah, I'd like to. I mean, there are short stories. The poems have just been reissued, collected poems. Adler wrote 1,200 poems in his lifetime. Several, 100 of them in the camps themselves. I'd like to do some work with them. And there are also 2 unpublished novels in the archive, which I need to have a look at and see what is there and what I can do with it.
Yeah.
But there are only so many hours in a day.
That's true. You've spent a great deal of time living with this person and with his work, a great many years, as well as I understand it, and you had a great struggle to get the translations published.
Yes, it took me a long time to find a publisher.
Peter Filkins, thank you.
Thank you.